Fantastic.
Great.
Okay, good. So let's get started. Yeah, so a quick word that I will be referring to papers that are available on ResearchGate and academia. So don't hesitate, download them or email me if you can't find it. Since the talk is about emotion, I think it's crucial to define what I understand by emotion. In fact, I would say that during my linguistic studies, well, I was more into French theoretical linguistics, so the word emotion never cropped up. As I started working on emotion, I realized that there is in fact a huge field in psychology that deals with emotions, where psychologists have very different definitions of what they understand by it. And the traditional and for a long time dominant paradigm was that of basic emotions. Paul Ekman and his colleagues defined emotions as discrete, functional, automatic responses to the environment, associated with specific physiological and behavioral reactions. So it meant that, according to them, the 6 pictures of the face of this man there are universal, meaning that anyone on planet Earth would recognize the emotion expressed by that face. And so there are 6: happiness, sadness, surprise, disgust, anger, and fear. So I assumed, okay, if that's the paradigm, I started believing in that paradigm. And then I realized that that paradigm of universality is in fact incompatible with the idea of multilingualism and multi-competence, where the role of variation is crucial, where the effect of culture is vital, and where the concept of change over time is also very important. So I discovered that there is also a so-called dimensional paradigm that see emotions as combination of universal dimensions, namely valence, which goes from negative to positive, and arousal, which goes from low activity to very high activity. And within that dimensional paradigm, I became really interested in Lisa Feldman Barrett's theory of constructed emotions. She sees emotions as domain non-specific constructions of the mind, shaped in the course of socialization. Crucially, her point is that emotions have no unique fingerprint. So it means that somebody who smiles at you is not necessarily happy, that tears don't necessarily indicate sadness, and that sometimes people struggle to identify the emotion that they are experiencing. And she has also a wonderful TED talk where she mentions the anecdote where she went on a blind date, and as she was having dinner with the gentleman, she realized that she felt like butterflies in her stomach, and she was surprised, and she thought, is my body reacting to this guy? Am I attracted to him? What does this mean? Is this me falling in love? So she asked herself all these questions, but because it was a first date, obviously they left each other at the restaurant door and both returned home. As she made it home, she became violently sick. And she realized that the butterflies in her stomach were in fact just a stomach bug, and that her reaction to him was totally independent of what was happening in her stomach. So it was a nice example of how we can sometimes misconstruct our own emotions or the emotions of people around us. And this reminds me that as a teacher, you can't always tell from your students' faces whether they enjoy themselves. And it brings back memory of a French class I taught at the Vrije Universiteit Brussel. I always finished the class with a song, and it was a very naughty song. And my students seemed to enjoy it, and they were singing along, except for one guy, a Pakistani guy, who was sitting in the corner, and his face was absolutely wooden. He wasn't showing any sign of enjoyment. I was even a bit worried that he might, in fact, attack me at some point. So I looked behind me and made sure that the door was open and that I could escape in case he would attack me. And then the class was finished and everybody filed out, and he came to me. He got up, came to me, brought his hand out, and I was almost ready to deflect a blow to the head. And then he shook my hand and said, "Sir, I so enjoyed this class." And I said, "Oh, really? Ah, thank you." And I was kind of relieved that, okay, I had misread his emotional state. So it means that he enjoyed himself, but he wasn't smiling. He wasn't showing any of the physical signs of enjoyment that the other students in the class were displaying. Okay, now I discovered that educational psychologists have worked on emotion, and I would like to mention the work by Pikrun, a German psychologist who developed a control value theory of academic emotions. It's not specifically in foreign language classes, it's in all education contexts, including maths classes and music classes. And he proposed a three-dimension taxonomy where valence, activation, and object focus help describe the academic emotion of students. I was surprised then that when I became interested in emotions in second language acquisition, that there was extremely little on it. And I discovered later that one explanation is that second language acquisition researchers typically see language learning as a matter of biology or chemistry implemented in the brain, as Jan Helstein wrote in 2007. Hence there was more a focus on, say, morpheme acquisition or syntax, rather than anything to do with elusive emotions of students. And hence emotions became what Meryl Swain called the elephants in the room, poorly studied, poorly understood, seen as inferior to rational thought. Now, that view has been changing, and in a special issue in the Modern Language Journal, Matthew Pryor said that, yes, there is an elephant in the room, but now we need to open up the windows, we need to explore other spaces, and emotion is really an important variable to consider. So I have been trying to convince my colleagues about this. First paper in 2005 on the psychological and emotional dimensions of SLA. Also Peter McIntyre and colleagues who wrote that emotions are fundamentally important motivators, because interestingly, motivation research is obviously emotional, but it's not explicit. So the emotions, I would say, are in the kind of the black box of the motivation, and only anxiety is mentioned explicitly. And in a recent chapter with Peter McIntyre and colleagues, we used Garner's attitudes and motivation test battery, and we linked the dimensions from that framework to the PANAS, 10 positive, 10 negative emotions. And we discovered that there was a strong positive correlation between the positive emotions of learners and the positive emotions that they had experienced in the previous week. So emotions and attitudes and motivation are linked. Here are a few books on the topic. Aneta Bravlenko in 2005, Emotions and Multilingualism. P.I. Resnick very recently on multilingual verbalization, perception of emotions, and my own book on emotions in multiple languages. And I explained to Eloy earlier that the painting you see above my right shoulder is one by my maternal grandfather. And in fact, I used his self-portrait from 1935 as a cover for my book. The publisher was very happy because it's a beautiful painting and it is an emotional representation of my granddad, but also because I have the painting, they didn't have to pay any copyright for it. Okay, so you remember the metaphor of the elephant. I have argued that in fact the elephants have had a lift off and that, for example, in the Modern Language Journal, since between 1917 and 2009, 700 articles had the word emotion in them, which is an average of 7.6 a year. Since 2010, 180 articles were published that had the word emotion in them, which is 22.5 a year. And I should add that the papers who dealt with emotion before 2010 typically focused on negative emotions and mostly on foreign language anxiety. Of course, the fact that the word emotion wasn't used doesn't mean that people weren't dealing with emotional stuff, but they didn't use the word emotion. So Jane Arnold, for example, talked about affect in language learning and defends the role of affect together with cognition. There's also been a growing interest in the psychology of language learning and teaching. In the last couple of years, we've started an international association for the psychology of language learning, and you have the current executive board there with Peter McIntyre, who is currently president of the association. Positive psychology has had a huge impact on the people interested in emotion in second language acquisition. And for those of you who are not familiar with positive psychology, I'll briefly explain what it is about. It looks at how normal people live and hence not people who have pathologies or difficulties. Positive psychologists don't deny that people may experience problems, but they want to make sure that the focus is not exclusively on the problems, but that it's a more holistic take on the individual. So it needs to be complemented with positive topics, and you have there a list of them: flow, hope, courage, well-being, optimism. In fact, I would say all the characteristics that teachers should have about their students. You can probably not be a good teacher if you're not optimistic about the fact that some of your learners will learn something in your class. There are three main pillars then in positive psychology: a focus on positive subjective experience, on positive individual traits, and also on positive institutions. And it's particularly relevant to anyone interested in learning because Fredrickson broaden and build theory explains that positive emotions allow learners to build resources. If they are in a positive mood, they will broaden their perspective. It will allow them also to absorb new information. Whereas being in a negative mood has the opposite effect. It narrows down the focus and it restricts the range of potential language impact. And as I have explained in a couple of overviews there, positive psychology has really had a profound impact on SLA. So I was talking about these things in 2010 with Peter McIntyre, and you see a picture of us both there at the 2012 JM-Dewaele conference, where we presented a first version of our paper, The Two Faces of Janus, and where we introduced the concept of foreign language enjoyment. So we decided that it would be nice to have data both on foreign language learners' anxiety, but also on their enjoyment. And the foreign language classroom anxiety definition is well known, the one by Elaine Horrocks and colleagues. And enjoyment we defined as a complex, positively balanced emotion with high arousal, resulting from a combination of challenge and perceived ability that allows tackling difficult tasks. So the combination of challenge, you will recognize the word challenge there, which is a basic concept on flow also, that you can only get into a state of flow if what you are doing is not over challenging, not under challenging, but just challenging enough. So we sat down and we used, we started with an existing scale by Ryan that was not specifically for foreign language learning, that was more to do with task and enjoyment in completing tasks. And we used a couple of items and adapted them and added other items to the scale. So you see that in total we have 21 items dealing with the things that might make a foreign language class enjoyable. And we've been very busy since trying to develop shorter versions of this scale. And we also have collaborated with Chinese colleagues who developed Chinese versions of this scale, like Li and colleagues who developed an 11-item scale that led to a 3-factor model with private enjoyment, teacher-linked enjoyment, and atmosphere. Also, Jin and Zhang that developed a 16-item scale in Mandarin, and who also came up with a 3-factor model: enjoyment of teacher support, English learning, student support, and I myself, we have just submitted paper with Eloise Botes and Samuel Greif from the University of Luxembourg with a short form FLE scale, 9 items, where we have enjoyed foreign language enjoyment as a higher order factor, and then 3 lower order factors, namely teacher appreciation, personal enjoyment, and social enjoyment. And here is the scale. If you are a student and you do a foreign language class, you may want to calculate the average. So you see the three first items are about personal enjoyment, then three about perception of the teacher, and then another three about, in fact, the group atmosphere and the social enjoyment. This is the short form of the foreign language classroom anxiety scale, which we used and adapted, or in fact, we used Elaine Horitz's original 33 item scale, where there are two items that are positively, that need to be recoded, as you see, items 4 and 5. So if you want, you could also calculate your anxiety score. And so in this original paper, the Janus paper 2014, we collected data from all over the world, from 1,746 learners aged between 11 and 75. And we were really interested in finding out the relationship between both. We were wondering whether enjoyment and anxiety were opposite poles of one dimension, or whether they were in fact separate dimensions. And we found a significant negative correlation, but that explains 30% of shared variance, which means in fact a small effect size, which allowed us to conclude that enjoyment and anxiety are different dimensions. It's true that somebody who experiences high anxiety tends to experience less enjoyment and vice versa. But in fact, it is perfectly possible to experience both high enjoyment and high anxiety simultaneously. And I will show you an example of that in a minute. Or in fact, experience no enjoyment and no anxiety, which would probably describe somebody who is emotionally disengaged from the class and who might be terminally bored. And we found a similar relationship in different corpora, also with Chinese EFL learners. So crucially, it's not a seesaw relationship that pushing one up doesn't necessarily bring the other down or vice versa. So eliminating anxiety, for example, is no guarantee that enjoyment will go up. And I think this is important for language teachers to realize. We also collected some open data. We had one open question. We asked our participants to describe an enjoyable episode. And we discovered that enjoyment peaks in activity that gives students some degree of autonomy and power, allows them to be creative, also to establish meaningful relations with their peers. And hence the classroom environment is a crucial contributor to enjoyment, as well as praise and encouragement from the teacher and the peers, combined with humor, trust, and respect. And here is an example. Simona, a Macedonian foreign language learner, who describes the experience of having to do a 2-minute speech in front of the class, where she explains that she was a bit nervous first and she felt her heart pounding, typical symptom of anxiety. But then it felt great standing there and expressing my opinion and knowing that all of the other students are listening to you with attention. So I guess Simona was on her way to becoming a teacher. And that's typically how you feel when you stand in front of your first class. But crucially, it shows that you can be both anxious and yet also enjoy the experience. So then we looked for the sources of enjoyment within the learner. We discovered that it is linked to age, gender, degree of multilingualism, also to level of mastery in the foreign language, to the relative standing in the group. So if you feel that you are above average in the group, then you will experience more enjoyment. Also linked to proficiency and test results. Typically higher proficiency, better test results are linked to more enjoyment, and there is a lot of research on this. Now here is a graph to visualize this briefly. in the original database. As you see, the low, intermediate, and intermediate learners reported more enjoyment than anxiety, but the difference wasn't that big. However, as they reached high, intermediate, and advanced level, you see that the enjoyment went further up and the anxiety went further down. And I would bet that the same pattern could be discovered in many other things that have nothing to do with language. If you learn to play the violin, I imagine that if you're a beginner or low intermediate player, that you might probably experience anxiety about the sound that will come out of your violin, but yet you enjoy being able to produce sound, so you will have some degree of enjoyment. But obviously, as you become more fluent and you see more people smiling around you when you take your violin out, your enjoyment will probably also go up and your anxiety will drop as you become more confident. Now, enjoyment and anxiety matter because they are linked to achievement. And Chen Li showed that, in fact, the Chinese EFL learners who were on the lower end of English achievement experienced significantly more anxiety and less enjoyment than those who were in the middle of the English achievement scale, whereas those who were at the top of the English achievement scale reported the highest levels of enjoyment, the lowest levels of anxiety. Now, obviously also personality factors that are linked to enjoyment and anxiety. With Peter McIntyre in a more recent study, we discovered that learners who score high on cultural empathy typically report higher enjoyment. Also, higher levels of emotional intelligence are linked to higher enjoyment. And Li and Xu did an interesting intervention study where they found that they could boost students' emotional intelligence through their intervention, and that it also boosted their enjoyment and lowered their anxiety. And then there are complex interactions between learner internal and micro, meso, and macro level external variables. One example is the attitudes that learners have towards the foreign language and the culture. If they are positive, then they will report higher levels of enjoyment. There is also the effect of the first language and versus the foreign language. So with the P.I. Resnick, we discovered that Austrian EFL learners reported lower levels of enjoyment in their German L1 classes than in their English foreign language classes. And one possible explanation is that the didactic approach is different in the L1 and EFL classes. There's also the effect of the specific teacher, and I will say a little bit more about that in a minute. The effect of the school, how much attention does the school pay to foreign languages? There is the effect of society and of the perception that a foreign language has within that particular classroom. So in a study that I did with Kazuya Saito and a former PhD student of mine, John Whitney, and my daughter, Livia, who finished her studies in French and linguistics, we collected data in 2 schools, Livia's former high school in Potters Bar, which was a selective state school, and Westminster School, where John Whitney is head of languages, which is an elite private school just next to Westminster Abbey. And we discovered that higher levels of enjoyment were linked to positive attitudes towards the foreign language teacher, also teachers' unpredictability, the amount of foreign language use in class, proportion of time that students actually spoke the foreign language in class, their test results, their relative standing, and their stage of development. So you see that the predictors of enjoyment were mostly teacher-based, whereas anxiety was linked to scores of attitudes towards the target language, test results, relative standing, stage of development. So none of the teacher variables what predicted anxiety, and that was an interesting finding. So here is an example of this finding. As you see, the more students had a positive attitudes towards the teacher, the more enjoyment they experienced in class. Also, the more the teacher used the foreign language in class, the higher their level of enjoyment. I must say that this was an item that I included in the questionnaire after Livia told me that one of her French teachers barely used any French in class. And that was, I think, year 12 or year 13. And I was so surprised. I said, why doesn't she use any French? And then Livia said, well, it's because she is Italian. I said, she's Italian? Then why is she teaching French? And she says, well, in fact, the headmaster told her that there weren't enough students for the Italian class. And then the headmaster said, well, you know Italian, I'm sure you can teach French too. And she said, well, I don't know French. So, well, isn't it a Romance language? So go teach French, or you're unemployed. And I must say that it kind of made me think twice about criticizing that poor teacher, because would you choose to teach something that you don't master completely rather than being unemployed? We could have a discussion on the ethics of that, I guess. And then teacher predictability. Highly predictable teachers scored significantly lower on their learners' enjoyment. So learners enjoy a teacher who is not too predictable. Then with Livia, we also, I can't help adding a little picture of her when she finished in Oxford last year. We wondered whether enjoyment and anxiety change over time. And so we compared the results for the three age groups, 12 to 13-year-olds, 14, 15-year-olds, 16, 18-year-olds. And as you see, the lines are pretty flat, completely flat for anxiety, meaning there is no change over time. And for enjoyment, there is a dip for the 14, 15-year-old group. And we think it is linked to the fact that they are preparing their GCSE exams, which means that teachers focus on test preparation and exam preparation, which apparently lowers the students' enjoyment of the class. Okay, now the interesting bit in that paper was that although there was little change over time, in fact, the predictors of enjoyment and anxiety changed over time. So the youngest ones, enjoyment was linked to their peers, and anxiety was linked to their self. For the middle-aged group, enjoyment was linked to the teacher, and anxiety still to themselves. And then in the oldest group, enjoyment was linked to the teacher mostly, and anxiety was linked to peers. And anxiety about peers making fun of them if they made mistakes in the class. And then with Livia, we continued focusing on a specific subsample of 40 high school students, again, from the previous corpus, who had two teachers for the same foreign language. So they had a main teacher and they had a secondary teacher. And what we discovered, as you see on the graph, was that the level of anxiety was exactly the same with both teachers. However, for enjoyment, there was a significant difference between the main teacher, that they enjoyed more, than the secondary teacher, where enjoyment was significantly lower. Then I repeated the same design with a former PhD student of ours, Yang Zhang, with Chinese undergraduate EFL students in Beijing. We discovered that they reported similar levels to our previous studies of enjoyment, but that the Chinese students seem to experience high levels of anxiety. And the predictor variables of enjoyment, as you see, mostly attitudes towards the teacher, and then proficiency level, relative standing, teacher joking, friendliness, attitudes towards English, whereas predictors of anxiety was mainly the relative standing among peers, and then again, English proficiency, attitudes towards English, attitudes towards the teacher. So you see that the teacher in the end explains less than 0.5% of variance. So it kind of confirmed the patterns that we found in other populations. And then we decided to focus specifically on teacher characteristics in a study with a BA student of mine, Magdalena Franco, and then my friend Kazia Saito, Spanish EFL learners. We discovered that teachers' friendliness was the strongest predictor of enjoyment, but that strength of the foreign accent was in fact a negative predictor of enjoyment. And we were a bit worried about that. So we ran an ANOVA to have a better understanding. And you see the graph on the left, where you see that participants who reported that their teacher had a pretty strong foreign accent, you see it's pretty stable up to those who had extreme strong foreign accent, the value of 5. There you have a significant drop. The difference between the other levels is not high. So it means that learners didn't mind that their teachers had a moderate to pretty strong foreign accent. It's only when they had a very strong foreign accent that enjoyment levels dropped. And then we realized that this might in fact not be linked to accent in itself. Maybe these were teachers who didn't like teaching English much and who maybe weren't very proficient in English and who didn't really try much. And the strong foreign accent might in fact have been just one aspect of a more complex picture. As you see, also teachers then who are more strict, they tend to the students tend to be more anxious in their classrooms. And then with Peter McIntyre, we did both. We did a mixed methods study. We included qualitative data. We asked participants to describe a memorable, enjoyable, and anxiety-provoking episode in the class. And as you see, where they talked about anxiety, it was typically linked to the self, their selves. Whereas if they talked about something that they had enjoyed, it was typically themselves and the teacher. So it confirmed what we found in the quantitative findings. So why do emotions matter? Again, Lee and colleagues show that the higher level of anxiety, the lower the level of performance, and on the other hand, that higher enjoyment is linked to better performance. So it's obvious that this is not simply that causality runs in both directions. It's not one thing that causes the other. I think it's influencing each other. Also, at some point, I realized that there was a danger that talking about complex emotions like enjoyment and anxiety, that it would be easy to essentialize this and to reduce it to a single value on a scale. And hence, a study with a former PhD student of ours, Liana Pavelescu, to a case study, 2 Romanian EFL learners. We used a retroductive approach. We collected classroom observations, interviews with the students, so different types of data. We discovered that their enjoyment and anxiety was in fact unique for each individual, and that these emotions are like types of soup, really, that you could have thick, chunky chowder, and you could also have strained, thin, clear stock, and they're all soups. And hence they quench thirst and satisfy hunger, etc. But they come in different shapes and textures. What also emerged from the data is that the emotions emerged, fluctuated and coexisted in different ways. And they changed over time in unique patterns. So it is important, I think, to also include an emic perspective on teacher emotions, on learner emotions. Then here I come to teacher emotions and on the teacher's role in the classroom. I use the metaphor of the teacher being like the conductor of an orchestra, where learners are the members of the orchestra, and hence the role of the teacher is in fact both crucial, but he is not the person producing the music. So the limelight is on the learners, and the conductor is a discrete person in the background. And I remember as a language teacher how I enjoyed it most when the learners didn't need me anymore, where I could be a discrete presence in the background because they were doing what I had asked them to do, and they were doing so productively and happily, and all I could do was become a shadow, like the invisible conductor, and I would only intervene if some intervention was needed. So teachers are key to setting the emotional tone in the class. And I think it's good also to have a bit of an emotional roller coaster in the class, where it's good to have an occasional burst of high intensity to stop learners from flatlining, from boredom. And even though sometimes I thought that this was a great activity, I realized that they were getting a bit bored. So I would tell them, okay, drop this, let's do that. And then you could see people sitting up and smiling. And that's when you realize as pilot that you needed to change direction. There is an increasing interest in foreign language teacher psychology these days. The role of teachers in the whirlpool of learners' emotions, the fact that teachers need to be antennas rather than unmovable rocks, and also the fact that teachers themselves are in dealing with hegemonic power relations, and that's the very interesting work by Benesh. And here are a couple of books on that topic. So you see Teacher Wellbeing there in the middle. It's the last book that came out, Sarah Mercer and Tammy Gregerson. And I also co-edited a book with Christina Gukonu and Jim King. It came out in May on the emotional roller coaster of language learning. A lot of work on foreign language teacher emotion is based on case studies, interviews, observations. There is relatively less quantitative research, so I enjoyed doing some quantitative research, collecting data from 513 EFL teachers. We discovered that those who scored high on trait emotional intelligence also reported more positive attitudes towards their students, reported feeling more creative in the classroom, also better at managing the classroom, felt pedagogically stronger, were more motivated, and loved English more. Also, longer experience in the teaching profession and being a female was linked to more positive attitudes towards students. So also an interesting phenomenon in this field is so-called emotional labor. I don't know whether you have heard of this. It's linked to Hochschild, who defined it as the management of feelings to create a publicly observable facial and bodily display. In fact, she was inspired by stewardesses who serve you breakfast with a smile after a long transatlantic flight or a flight around the world, where they are probably deadly tired, their feet are hurting, you are complaining because your coffee isn't warm enough, or you want a tea and not coffee, etc. They have to keep that smile on their face. It's effortful. It is emotional labor. And hence they use different strategies to keep that smile there. They could be surface acting or deep acting, or they could express naturally felt emotions, positive emotions there, but even that is effortful. And I think that applies very much to the language classroom also, that as a teacher, if you feel down and unhappy, yet the moment you enter your classroom, you need to shield that. You need to use emotional labor in order to create a positive atmosphere in the class. And usually it works. In fact, I remember being very lovesick the first year I was teaching, and I was terribly depressed. And then I entered the classroom and I realized, oh, I can't show them how I feel. So I pretended to be very happy. And for the duration of the class, it worked. And then the moment I left that classroom, suddenly it hit me again. Oh, I was very depressed. So emotional labor can be occasionally useful. Of course, if you do too much emotional labor, it could lead to burnout. With Jim King and Christina Gokonu, we joked or half joked that foreign language teachers need to have some of the skills of martial artists. They need to be able to take a blow without buckling. They need to be able to regulate their emotions. And I'm saying this, of course, because I am a karateka, and I've been doing it for 15 years. And I find it really interesting to see the parallelisms between the dojo and the classroom, and between going up for your black belt and going up for your PhD viva, where you are criticized in the viva. In the dojo, it means that you might get a strong kick in the stomach, and you are not allowed to show anger. If you show anger, in fact, you fail your black belt. You probably fail your viva too. So you need to be able to function under pressure and not succumb to emotions. So what can teachers do to control learners' anxiety and boost their enjoyment? Well, there is a huge literature on this, and Borg is a crucial reference, using non-threatening techniques, developing solidarity and trust, establishing rapport, radiating positive feeling, creating a supportive emotional environment, using hope, optimism, humor, and crucially also maintaining, the teachers should maintain their own mental well-being. So it's crucial for further research to continue using mixed methods research. I think we could also expand the range of timeframes. More longitudinal research is needed, as well as work that is statistically rigorous and sophisticated. I like Li and Shu's work on using exploratory and experimental research. We need to look at the effects of specific target languages, as well as comparing the emotions of students in their L1 classes and in multiple foreign language classes. It's also important to try and see how learner emotions are linked to engagement, motivation. What can we do to develop more enjoyable and successful teaching techniques? Also, there's been a burst of research lately on foreign language learning boredom and how that can be tackled. And also the insight that relations between emotions and foreign language performance are non-linear, meaning that more of an emotion is not linked to gradually better or worse performance. So that's also worth looking into. And here are some references. So that's it. I'd be happy to answer your questions.